Welcome back to our study in the book of Philippians. I hope you've got a copy of the scriptures with you, and I want to say thank you for joining us in this. I hope that God is challenging you through all of this. I know I've been challenged in putting these lessons together, as it's always the case. But we're in Philippians chapter 2, and just to kind of recap, to sum up where we've been. Paul has had a strong plea for unity in chapter 1. When we get into chapter 2, the end of chapter 1 and the beginning of chapter 2, the solution to unity, how to achieve unity, is through selflessness, is through placing the needs of others above yourself. The perfect example of that comes right after that. Paul starts talking about Jesus and how Jesus saw our needs as more important than his own. And so he came and left. He left all the splendors of eternity and became a man and dwelt among us and was obedient to the point of death. And in doing all of that, he became this perfect example of humility and creating unity at the same time. Then Paul talks a little bit, some Christian living about himself in that same aspect. And then today, he's going to focus on two men, Timothy and Epaphroditus, and who these two men were to Paul and how they kind of fit this puzzle of humility and unity and how those come together through these two guys. So I want to start reading in verse 12, Philippians chapter 2, verse 12, and we'll read through the end of the chapter. So then, my beloved, just as you have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who is at work in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may prove yourselves to be blameless and innocent, children of God, above reproach in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you appear as lights in the world, holding fast the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I may have cause to glory, because I did not run in vain, nor toil in vain. But even if I am being poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrifice and service of your faith, I rejoice and share my joy with you all. And you too, I urge you, rejoice in the same way and share your joy with me. But I hope in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you shortly, so that I may also be encouraged when I learn of your condition. For I have no one else of kindred spirit who will genuinely be concerned for your welfare. For they all seek after their own interests, not those of Christ Jesus. But you know of his proven worth, that he served with me in the furtherance of the gospel like a child serving his father. Therefore, I hope to send him immediately, as soon as I see how things go with me. And I trust in the Lord that I myself also shall be coming shortly. But I thought it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother and fellow worker and fellow soldier, who is your messenger and minister to my need, because he was longing for you and was distressed because you had heard that he was sick. For indeed he was sick to the point of death, but God had mercy on him, and not on him only, but also on me, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow. Therefore I have sent him all the more eagerly, in order that when you see him, you may rejoice, and I may be less concerned about you. Therefore, receive him in the Lord with all joy, and hold men like him in high regard, because he came close to death for the work of Christ, risking his life to complete what was deficient in your service to me. Growing up, my dad always said that you become the people you surround yourself with. And so if you wanted to be the best used car salesman in town, what you needed to do was find the best used car salesman in town and just walk in his shoes. Just follow him. Learn how he dealt with people. Learn how he talked. Learn how he thought. Learn how he handled situations. Just learn. And do that with 2 or 3 people just like him, and you'll become the greatest car salesman in town. If you want to be the best teacher, find the best teacher you can and just walk in their shoes, because you become who you surround yourself with. And in the church, it is so true. We become the people who we surround ourselves with. I see this, honestly, far too clearly every fall. We'll have contact with a couple hundred students that will be coming to the University of Arkansas who have some connection in some way to the church. And we'll send out letters, we'll write text messages, we'll phone calls, we'll have events. We'll go over and above as much as we can to get in contact with these students, to invite them to things, to get to know them, to love them, to pour ourselves into them. And we go through a lot of effort. And by the time it all sifts through, there's really 5 to 10 people that are really genuinely interested in their faith. And one of the biggest threats to young Christians coming on to a college campus is the friends that they make. In the first few weeks of school, it's amazing to me how the first few weeks of school are so important to somebody's faith. And the question really is, what friends do they make? Do they make friends who are faithful, who are Christians, who are going to encourage them in the right way? Or do they make friends in the world who are going to encourage them in all the wrong ways? My dad would always say, you become who you surround yourself with. Well, here's two men that Paul was surrounded by, Timothy and Epaphroditus. And so I want to look at those two guys today and just kind of explore, what did Paul see in these two men, and how can that encourage us to live faithfully in the midst of a corrupt generation? So Timothy, what do you know about Timothy? He starts off in verse 19, and he wants to send Timothy to the church in Philippi, but he chooses not to because he wants to see how things, as he says, work out with me. Probably in reference to his appearance before Nero, and he wants to see how that's all going to play out before he sends Timothy to Philippi. And so instead of sending Timothy, he's going to send Epaphroditus. But he wants to send Timothy. It seems like Timothy has a unique relationship with the church, so that's kind of the historical setting there. But what do you know about Timothy and Paul and their relationship? Well, let's just look at Timothy for just a second. First off, probably born in Lystra of Lycaonia. Lystra was where Paul first came across Timothy. Our first rendering of him, or reading of him, is in Acts chapter 16. On Paul's second missionary journey. But Paul had actually probably met Timothy on his first missionary journey when he was traveling through Lystra and preaching the gospel there. If you recall, Lystra is where Paul was drug out of the city and stoned. Probably not the greatest memories Paul has of Lystra. But when Paul comes back through on his second missionary journey, Timothy is already a strong brother. He has a great reputation in the church and his family. And so it's probably Paul met him on his first missionary journey in Acts chapter 14 and taught him the gospel then, and then is going to reunite in Acts chapter 16. But all we really know is that Paul meets up with him in Acts chapter 16 on his second missionary journey. So in that, there's in the first 3 verses of 16, there's a good bit revealed about Timothy. So flip over to Acts chapter 16, and we'll just read 1 through 3. So Paul comes through Lystra. He went from, in the end of chapter 15, Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. And now in chapter 16, verse 1, he comes to Derbe, and then he comes to Lystra. And he's going to pause in Lystra to tell us a little bit about Timothy. Behold, a certain disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. And he was well spoken of by the brethren who were in Lystra and Iconium. And Paul wanted this man to go with him, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in those parts, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. So here's Paul passing through Lystra, meets up with Timothy, and asks Timothy to join him on this journey, which is really going to turn into, at least from Paul's perspective, probably a lifelong relationship of working with this man. Things that we know about Timothy from this, we know that he had a faithful grandmother, a great faithful Jewish mother and grandmother. We know that his father was not a Jew, that he was a Gentile or a Greek. And so this means that Timothy comes with kind of a mixed heritage. He's got some Jewish influences and he's got some Gentile influences. And so as Paul asks him to join, one of the first things that Paul does is has Timothy circumcised. And this had nothing to do with Timothy's faith, because in the chapter right before that, Acts chapter 15, there were some men of James who were going around saying that everybody needed to be circumcised. All these Gentiles basically needed to go from Gentile to Jew to Christian. And Paul disagreed with them and said they don't need to be circumcised. They can just become Christians. The law of Moses has been done away. None of that is in effect anymore. And this causes quite the uproar. There's a big meeting in Jerusalem with elders and apostles. All these people come together and they're all in the same agreements that no, people do not have to be circumcised in order to be a part of the kingdom. And they make that known. And that was important because that teaching came out of Jerusalem, so it needed to be corrected back in Jerusalem. But what we do know is Paul is not circumcising Timothy for Timothy's sake. What he says is because there's a lot of Jews in this area that know Timothy, that know that his father is not a Jew, that Timothy is kind of this mixed bag. And Paul didn't want to run into any problems about bringing a Gentile into the synagogue, because Paul would go to a city. One of the first things that he does, hits the synagogue, starts preaching. Well, who's he got with him? He's got Silas, and now he's got Timothy. And if Timothy comes in and has this Gentile upbringing, that's just going to cause all kinds of problems. And so in order to kind of take care of Timothy's influence on the Jewish community, Paul wants to have him circumcised. If you remember, Paul made that mistake later on, or at least was accused of making that mistake, let me say. I think it's in Acts 21, where he's accused of bringing some Gentiles into the tabernacle or the temple, and it's a huge problem. It turns into a giant uproar and a blow up, and honestly, it's kind of the spiral that begins this whole thing that ends Paul standing before Nero. And so when Paul wants to circumcise Timothy, think of it from two perspectives in Timothy's mind. Number one, Timothy is willing to do whatever it takes to be out there preaching the gospel with Paul. And if that means that as a young man he needs to be circumcised, then so be it. That's what needs to happen. If that's what's going to keep the Jews from stumbling at his message, then it's worth it. And so Timothy has a heart for the kingdom, a heart for preaching, and a willingness. And here we come back to our whole point coming in from the end of chapter 1 into chapter 2. Timothy has a willingness to put the needs of others above his own. And it's demonstrated by this willingness to be circumcised, even though it's not going to affect his faith at all. What else do we know about Timothy? He has a great reputation with the brethren, both in Lystra and Iconium. We see that in verse 2. So he's not just kind of a random brother who hasn't really been in the forefront. Apparently he's already maybe teaching and preaching. It's hard to say exactly, but he has a good reputation. People know about him. And not only the brethren, but apparently since the Jews know of him and his mixed heritage, he's got a reputation among the Jews as well. We also know that he joins Paul and Silas on this journey. We've mentioned that. And Paul quickly learns to trust Timothy. There's going to be several occasions as you read through the rest of the book of Acts that Paul is going to send Timothy ahead to go to such and such a town, to encourage them, to strengthen them, and then we'll join you in whatever, couple months. And the opposite was also true. Paul would leave Timothy behind to encourage and support brethren or to take care of some things, and then Timothy would catch up. But Paul entrusted Timothy with a lot of things. And so as they're working on this journey, he's preaching and teaching with Paul, but at the same time, he's given a lot of responsibility just on his own. He carried letters for Paul. In this case, he was going to carry this letter to the church in Philippi, but Epaphroditus ended up being the one that carried it instead. But originally, it seemed like Paul was going to entrust that to Timothy, which didn't seem too out of character for him. And at some point, The timeline's hard to put together, but most people figure that it's after Paul is, before Nero. Things go well with that, and so Paul is out of that house arrest, and he sends Timothy to Ephesus to preach. And that's when Paul writes 1st and 2nd Timothy. Some would say that it's earlier than that it's while Paul's in prison that he actually sends Timothy to Ephesus to do these things. Again, the timeline's hard to put together, but one thing we do know is Paul trusted Timothy to go to a city, a major city like Ephesus, and to work with the church there. And the church needed some help. And Paul felt that Timothy was the man to do it. So a lot of good characteristics of Timothy coming out of Philippians chapter 2. Look at how he describes him in verse 20. He says he's of kindred spirit, like he and Paul thought alike, maybe in preaching the gospel, in their desire to seek the lost. Also in verse 20, Paul says that he has a genuine concern for the welfare of the church in Philippi. A genuine concern for them. Timothy loved those people. And I would not be one bit surprised if Paul could say that about every city that they went to, that Timothy loved those people. In verse 22, his worth was proven in that Paul had seen Timothy in action on the mission field. In verse 21, we see that other people, other Christians, other brothers were looking out for their own interests, but not Timothy. Timothy was willing to put the interests of others above himself. And so, putting all of this together, Timothy seems like a great gospel preacher. But there's some downsides. Everybody has their weaknesses. Timothy has his weaknesses as well. In 1 Corinthians chapter 16, here Paul is writing to the church in Corinth about Timothy and the possibility of Timothy coming. Chapter 16, verses 10 and 11. Now, if Timothy comes, see that he is with you without cause to be afraid. For he's doing the Lord's work, as I also am. Let no one therefore despise him, but send him on his way in peace, so that he may come to me, for I expect him with the brethren. So interestingly, he has to almost warn the church, chastise the church, prep the church, if you will, that Timothy's coming, and I don't want you guys to despise him. I don't want you to discourage him. I want you to be there for him. Don't give him any cause to be afraid. Well, why would Timothy be afraid? Well, that seems to be kind of a trend in Timothy's life. If you look in 2 Timothy chapter 1, starting in verse 6, Paul says this: For this reason, I remind you, and here he's talking to Timothy. He's writing a letter while Timothy is preaching in Ephesus. For this reason, I remind you to kindle afresh the gift of God, which was in you through the laying on of my hands. For God has not given us a spirit of timidity, but of power and love and discipline. Therefore, do not be ashamed of the testimony of our Lord, or of me, his prisoner, but join with me in suffering for the gospel according to the power of God. So Timothy seems to be maybe kind of a nervous, maybe afraid, maybe a little bit shy, a little timid. And Paul has to encourage the church in Corinth, don't give him any reason to be afraid. He has to write specifically to Timothy and say, you need to kick it up a notch. Don't be afraid, don't be timid, don't be ashamed. And you might be thinking, well, what kind of a preacher is ashamed of the gospel? And I don't know that Timothy was ashamed of it, but it does seem pretty consistent that he was a little bit shy and a little bit timid of things that were happening around him. We also see that he was young. In 1 Timothy 4, verse 12, Paul tells him, don't let people look down on your youthfulness. Even from when Paul joined him at a very early age, probably in his teenage years when Paul joins him in Acts 16. By the time he's in Ephesus preaching, he's still not a strong, respected man in the community. He's still young in their eyes. And Paul says, don't let people look down on you for that. In 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 23, we find that Timothy has some health issues, that he's got some ongoing chronic health issues. And Paul says that maybe you need to drink some wine for your stomach in order to help that. He's He's struggling with his health. We also know from Acts chapter 16 that he comes from this mixed family. He doesn't have this nice, pure heritage. And so Timothy has a lot of trust from Paul. He's given a lot of responsibility by Paul, but he also has some shortcomings. He's not just this bold, out there preacher like Paul is. He's a different kind of person altogether, and yet Paul still loves him and trusts him. So why would Paul choose Timothy? Why would he choose somebody that's young, that has a Jew-Gentile heritage, that had health issues, that was timid? Why would Paul choose that as somebody to come and preach the gospel with him? And I think the answer is in verse 20. Paul says, I have no one else of kindred spirit who will genuinely be concerned for your welfare. I think this is one of the best characteristics of Timothy. He loves the church. He loves them. He's willing to do whatever it takes to help the church, and Paul knows that. So yeah, is he young? Yeah. Does he have some health issues? Yeah. Is he timid? Yeah. But he has a genuine concern for the health, the spiritual health of people. Imagine that you were on a search committee, like a preacher search committee. I've been on a couple of those. They're not the most exciting things to be on. You might, they sound more fun than they are. What kind of qualities should a church look for in a minister? Here's typically what comes up, and maybe your experiences are different from mine, but I think you can relate. Here's what comes up. We want a preacher that is married and has kids that can relate to our families, that is has energy and youth left. We want a preacher who has some education, some Bible degrees. We want a preacher who has some experience. We want a preacher who has some age and some wisdom on them. Like this is who we want. Is that what Paul was looking for? When Paul hits Lystra and he decides to let Timothy join him, those don't seem to be the qualities that Paul is looking for. What he ends up with is a young man who's not married, that has this mixed baggage of a background, really doesn't have any formal education, all kinds of health problems, but he loves the church. He has a love for the brethren and a passion to help them. That's what Paul was looking for in someone to join him on the mission field. When you're looking for a spouse or to be in a relationship, what qualities are you looking for? Are you looking for physical qualities of attractiveness and the ability to make a living and things of that nature? Or are you asking hard questions of, do they love the Lord? And I know you're supposed to ask that. That's one that, but is it really the question that you're concerned about? I know it's supposed to be, but is it? When your sons and daughters are bringing home people that they're dating or they're looking at getting married, what are you concerned about those men and women that they're thinking about marrying? Are you concerned about their physical well-being, their health, their ability to make a living? Or are you concerned about their relationship with the Lord? And again, don't just say, well, yes, of course, that's what I'm concerned about. I'm concerned about their relationship with God. That's all I'm concerned about. Is it really? Like, be honest with yourself. Is it really what you're concerned about? Or is it a concern? It would be nice if they would be a Christian. That would be better. But as long as they can, provide for themselves, they have a good education and a strong work ethic. It was just that one for Paul. Like, did they love the Lord? Did they love his people? You know the answers to those questions that you're supposed to choose. But is it really the case? This is what made Timothy a great value to the kingdom. Not his health or his age or his wisdom or his education, his pedigree. His love for the brethren. Matter of fact, Jesus said in John chapter 13, you remember verses 34 and 35, when Jesus says, by this all men will know that you are my disciples, that you have love for one another. That's the characteristic that's going to display Jesus into this world. That's the characteristic that Timothy had. That's what Paul was looking for. that what we're looking for as we surround ourselves with people in our lives? So there's Timothy. So let's turn our attention to Epaphroditus, starting in verse 25. So again, he wanted to send Timothy to the church in Philippi, both to carry this letter, to bring back news about how the church is doing, but he decided not to send Timothy. Instead, he chose to send Epaphroditus. And we don't know nearly as much about Epaphroditus, but what we do know is what Paul, at least from here, Paul tells us that he's my brother, so he's a faithful Christian, my fellow worker, right, in verse 25. So he was somebody that preached the gospel alongside with Paul. Fellow soldier, which is a term that Paul used every once in a while in regards to his relationship as a preacher and a minister and a missionary. And so Epaphroditus seemed to be one of these guys that stood right by Paul, that was out preaching and teaching the gospel right next to him. Also, he helped Paul quite a bit. Notice in verse 28, he says, "Therefore, I've sent him all the more eagerly in order that you, when you see him again, you may rejoice, and I may be less concerned about you. Therefore, receive him in the Lord with all joy, and hold men like him in high regard, because he came close to death for the work of Christ, risking his life to complete what was deficient in your service to me." And so Epaphroditus was somebody who was helping Paul. He had a great heart of a servant and taking care of Paul while Paul is under house arrest, and he's not able to be working as a tent maker like he did sometimes. He's not able to be out preaching the gospel like he loved to do. And so Paul is compromised in all of these, and he needs somebody to help him. He needs somebody to be running errands, somebody to provide food even. Basic necessities of Paul's life are out of his control anymore, and he needs people to help him. And Epaphroditus seems to be a brother who stands right by Paul through all of this. So look at a couple characteristics. Just want to look at two characteristics of Epaphroditus in this. Starting in verse 26, there's number one. Right? He was longing for you all, the church in Philippi, he's longing for you all, and was distressed because you had heard that he was sick. Okay, so Epaphroditus was concerned because the church in Philippi had heard that Epaphroditus was sick, and that bothered him. He didn't want the church to be stressed and to have to be dealing with kind of the concern over Epaphroditus, because Epaphroditus was sick. And not just a small sickness. Paul says that he was sick to the point of death in verse 27. I don't know what it was, but it was serious. Serious enough that Paul was concerned about him. And he was afraid that Epaphroditus was going to die, and he was thankful that God spared him in verse 27. But Epaphroditus' concern was about the church in Philippi, and that this would be a cause of concern for them, and he didn't want them to have to deal with all that stress and concern, especially during this time of persecution and things that are coming. Wow, what a beautiful character. Epaphroditus could have just been, consumed with himself. He's sick to the point of death. Like when I'm sick, not even to the point of death, if I just get the flu, all I can think about is myself, and I just want to be alone and just sit in front of the TV for 2 days and just veg and woe is me. But Epaphroditus seems to be still out and about and concerned about the brethren and serving Paul, even though he's sick to the point of death. Talk about somebody who puts the needs of others above himself. He didn't even want the churches to be distracted by being concerned about his health. And so I wonder if we have that same kind of concern about people. Do we just want attention for ourselves? Do we just want people to focus on us and talk about us and be concerned about us? Epaphroditus was a man who sought the well-being of others above himself, even above his own health. And I'm not suggesting that we should neglect our health by any means, but what I am saying is it shows what was really important to Epaphroditus. Secondly, in verse 30, another character trait of Epaphroditus, he says, because he came close to death for the work of Christ, risking his life to complete what was deficient in your service to me. Okay, so I'm not sure what it looks like to, fully to live as a Christian in the first century, but Epaphroditus came close to death for the work of Christ. Now, there's a strong Jewish persecution at this time, and there's an increasing Roman persecution coming up at this time. And so, yeah, there's reason to have a fear for your life if you are a vocal Christian, an outgoing Christian, one who is preaching and teaching and proclaiming your faith. And I'm not exactly sure, what that looked like for Epaphroditus, because we live in a pretty, relatively to that time, we live in a pretty cush system. Our biggest fear is not persecution to death. I think our biggest fear in 21st century America in regards to our faith is people at work laughing at us, people in the classroom telling jokes about us. Like that humiliation, I think, is about as far as persecution is going to go in 21st century America. There might be other places in the world, there are other places in the world where if you're too vocal with your faith, you are putting your life at risk. But America is not one of them. And we're not even on the path for that to be the case. Some humiliation, people might make fun of you. Yeah, okay, I'll give you that one. You're going to have to deal with that. But nothing compared to what Epaphroditus was having to deal with. Let me give you another one of these loaded questions. What if, you know this scenario, what if somebody came in, pointed a gun to your head and said, deny Christ and I'll let you live? And we like to have this idea in our mind that, no, I would never deny Christ. In that moment, I would be so strong in my faith. As a matter of fact, I would be twice as strong in my faith then as I am now, and I would never deny Christ. As a matter of fact, I would start telling that person about the grace of God and how they can find forgiveness for their lives. Like we have this idea that we would face death and we would gladly take a bullet for the gospel without fear. But let's be honest, we're not going to face that situation. But we feel like we would be faithful in it, don't we? And I think the hard question is, if you're not willing to face the coworker who's mocking you, how would you face a bullet? If you're not willing to face the professor that's laughing at you, if your faith can't stand against that, how is it going to stand against somebody holding a gun to your head? Why are those situations so drastically different? If you're not faithful in the small day-to-day things that challenge your faith, why would you be faithful in the giant one that challenges your life? I think, I don't know if this is a good illustration or not, something I came up with. What if you had a great passion for the poor and the homeless, and somebody says, hey, well, why don't you build a homeless shelter then? And you look at all the numbers and it's like, well, it's going to cost me, a couple $100,000 to build a homeless shelter. And you look at all your assets and you're like, wow, I actually could do that. I could liquidate all my retirement accounts or savings accounts or whatever. I could liquidate everything and I could actually build this. Would you? Well, it all depends on how strong your passion is, right? But imagine that person who isn't necessarily going to build, drain all of their financial resources in order to build this homeless shelter. What if that person just happens to come across a homeless person on the street that needs a meal? Do you think they're going to help them with a meal? Absolutely. If they're willing to drain their life savings in order to build a shelter, they'll throw $5 out for a meal. But I'll tell you this, if they're not willing to give $5 for a meal, there's no way that they're going to drain their savings in order to build a homeless shelter. It just doesn't happen. If you're not faithful in the small challenges, if you can't face the small persecutions, why do you think you would be faithful against one that involved your life? And I didn't mean for that to be discouraging to you, but I just kind of wanted to challenge you, because I know that if you're vocal about your faith in the classroom, in the workplace, that you get lashback. You're going to get mockery. People are going to laugh at you. They're going to start not inviting you to certain things. They're going to talk about you. Do you care? Do you even care? I don't think we should. I think we should be standing with Christ in all of those moments. We need to focus on the daily dying to self and letting Christ reign in our words, in our thoughts, in our actions. And then, when we've got a good handle on that, we might be prepared for a major test that would come across us. Back to Epaphroditus. How did Epaphroditus serve Christ? It wasn't just in preaching and teaching. Look in verse 29. Therefore, receive him in the Lord with all joy and hold men like him in high regard, because he came close to death for the work of Christ. And what was that work of Christ? Risking his life to complete what was deficient in your service to me. So the church in Philippi had some service that they were rendering to Paul, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't happening. There was a break in that. And Epaphroditus was picking up the slack. And so Epaphroditus was not serving the church in Philippi. He wasn't serving the church in Rome, where Paul was a prisoner. He was just serving Paul. But notice he calls that serving, or the work of Christ in serving me. Now, it may be that, this service that put his life on the line was going to Philippi and getting these funds that they were supporting Paul with and bringing them, maybe making that journey or even carrying this letter was life-threatening to Epaphroditus. Maybe Epaphroditus was soliciting other churches throughout Macedonia in order to support Paul while he was in prison and unable to work for himself. Or maybe Epaphroditus was working himself to support. Whatever it was, Paul had needs. The church in Philippi was helping, but they couldn't make it all. They couldn't match his whole needs. And so Epaphroditus was stepping up and doing the work of Christ and risking his life for that. It's interesting that Epaphroditus was serving Paul. And Paul says Epaphroditus was doing the work of Christ. It reminds me of Matthew chapter 25. It's a judgment scene. The king has called all the people before his glorious throne. Then in verse 34, the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundations of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. Naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me." Then the righteous will answer, saying, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? And when did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or naked and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and come to you?" See, these guys are standing before the throne, and Jesus is going to say, "You guys fed me when I was hungry, and you clothed me when I was naked, and when I was sick, you came and visited me." And all these people before the throne are going to say, "Jesus, I never gave you anything to eat. I never even saw you thirsty. What are you talking about, Jesus?" And his response is going to be, verse 40, "Truly I say to you, to the extent that you did it to one of these brothers of mine, even the least of them, you did it to me." Epaphroditus was serving Paul, meeting the needs that Paul had. Paul viewed that service as the work of Christ. When you serve the brethren, maybe in the smallest thing, you're serving Christ. When you come out and you mow the church lawn, when you prepare the communion cups, when you're vacuuming the classrooms, when you're washing the windows, when you're filling up the bus with gas, with whatever small and maybe what seems insignificant task you are accomplishing for the brethren, you're doing it for Christ. It's the work of Christ. And don't think small things about it. Don't think small things at all. You know, if I had to kind of envision Timothy and Epaphroditus as members of the church, like 21st century America. Pick your, whatever street, Church of Christ. There they are. Timothy and Epaphroditus. I don't see them as a member who comes in Sunday, spends an hour worshiping, offers some criticism, leaves, not to be seen again until next week when they come in, sit for an hour, offer some criticism, and leave, not to be seen again for another week. No, that's not Timothy. That's not Epaphroditus. These were men who were deep in the work of the church. They were heavily involved in people's lives. They had a deep love for the brethren, not just the church in Rome, but the church in Philippi and surely other places as well. These people were deeply invested emotionally, spiritually, physically. Timothy and Epaphroditus were deeply invested in the church. They're not just, as we say, a Sunday-only Christian, that phrase. Not these guys. These guys were willing to give their lives to serve Christ. To them, Christ and the church was all that mattered. And that's why you look at the bond that Paul has with these two men. Look at how he describes them. In verse 22, he describes Timothy as he would a father and a son, a child serving his father as they were out preaching the gospel. Like, what a beautiful illustration of a father and a child serving together. And then for Epaphroditus, notice in verse 27, Epaphroditus was sick, remember, to the point of death even, and God had mercy on him so that Epaphroditus didn't die of that sickness. But Paul also says, not just on him, but also on me. God had mercy on Paul so that he wouldn't have sorrow upon sorrow. As if Paul he couldn't fathom the idea of not having Epaphroditus with him. This is how close he was to these guys. He worked, he preached, he taught, he lived next to these two men. And so my final question in all of this, which kind of takes us back to the beginning, is what kind of people do you surround yourself with? What kind of people do you surround yourself with? Are they people like Epaphroditus and Timothy who are all in with the faith, all in, willing to die for the work of Christ? What kind of people do you surround yourself with? You become who you surround yourself with. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, there's a great discussion about the resurrection, and it appears there's some people who are denying that the resurrection was going to happen. And Paul says to kind of be careful of these false teachers who are going around kind of hurting people's faith. And here's what he says, 1 Corinthians 15:33, do not be deceived. Bad company corrupts good morals. You can be of the greatest moral character, but if you surround yourself with immoral characters, they're going to corrode your character. They're going to eat away at it. And I know you're thinking like, not me. Like, I live in the world, I work in the world, I know what it's like out there. I can be strong, I can be faithful. Like, I'm not being influenced by these people. And you know what God says to you? Do not be deceived. If you read bad company corrupts good morals and you say, yeah, well, not for me though, then you need to read the first part. Do not be deceived, because you've been deceived. Because you absolutely become who you surround yourself with. Now, I wouldn't suggest, and I'm not, that you only surround yourself with Christians. You need to be in the world. You need to have some friends that are not Christians. You need to have some people in your life that are immoral and godless. Because if you don't, who are you going to share your faith with? Who are you going to be a light to? What change are you actually going to bring about for people's eternity? So yeah, you need to have that segment of your life. There needs to be non-Christians in your life so that you can be a witness to them. But don't let them be the people in your life. You know, the people that when everything's coming down, those are the people you turn to. When your world is falling apart, they're standing next to you. You want a Timothy, you want an Epaphroditus standing next to you in those times. If you surround yourself with people of questionable morals or questionable faith, it will have a long-term effect on yours. So I want you to have that balance. But I want you to find an Epaphroditus, and I want you to find a Timothy in your life, that you could be Paul and lean on these guys whenever you need. And I'm sure that the opposite was true. I'm sure when those men had hard times, they leaned on Paul just the same. And so don't just look for a Timothy and an Epaphroditus to be in your life. Be a Timothy, be an Epaphroditus for somebody. Be somebody of great faithfulness that is going to give great courage when other people's faith is struggling and their lives are falling apart, and you stand as a pillar for them, a pillar of faith that will not be moved, that they can lean on and they can fall on and they can cry on. You be that for somebody else just as well. Because we become who we surround ourselves with. Let's pray before we close out. Father, we come before you. And we thank you for men like Paul, who devoted their lives to your work. We thank you for men like Timothy and Epaphroditus, who were ready to give everything in the service of your kingdom because they loved you and they loved your children. And God, countless faithful men and women have lived through the years. And I pray that in this generation, that today, Father, you would continue to raise up strong, faithful men and women that we can rely on and trust in and lean on. Father, raise us up to be those strong, faithful men and women that other people can lean on, that we can be pillars of strength, pillars of faith for them. I just pray, God, that you would help us to think of others before ourselves and pursue the unity of your kingdom. And we pray it all in Jesus' name.